In the vast silence of the New Mexico desert, where dust and memory linger heavier than rain, one broken man rides toward fate. What began with laughter and scorn will end in fire, blood, and an unexpected bond. This is the story of Elias McGraw and the 3 Apache women who changed his life forever. The desert stretched out before him like a vast sheet of hammered copper, glowing red and gold beneath the sinking sun. Elias McGraw leaned forward in the saddle, his body bent and weary, one hand resting on the pommel, while the other clutched the reins with stubborn determination. His horse, a rangy, dust-caked gelding, limped with every few steps, head bobbing low, ribs visible beneath its hide. They had been on the trail for weeks, perhaps months. Time had become a thing measured only by the rising and falling of light, and the steady gnaw of hunger in his gut. His coat, once a rancher's pride of durable leather, hung loose at the shoulders, cracked by sun and rain. A battered hat shielded his eyes, though the brim sagged and the crown bore a ragged hole where a bullet had once grazed him. Around his neck hung a faded bandana, stiff with sweat and dust. But the only object that still seemed to carry weight was the thin band of gold circling his finger. That wedding ring caught what little light the sun gave, flashing briefly like a reminder of all he had buried. Elias had lost it all. The cattle, once numbering in the hundreds, had withered in the drought. His ranch house, which he and Mary had built board by board, had been sold at auction when the debts piled higher than he could pay, and Mary, his Mary, was gone to the grave, lowered beneath a sky that poured rain for the first time in months. Too late to save the land, too late to save her. Now he rode not toward something, but away from nothing. The air cooled as the sun dipped, shadow spreading across the jagged hills. In the distance, faint wisps of smoke curled upward. Elias squinted, tightening the reins as his horse stumbled onward. The smell reached him faintly. Wood smoke, meat roasting, voices carried, thin on the wind. A settlement. By the time he approached the ring of lodges, dusk had deepened. The Apache camp sat quiet but watchful, nestled against a ridge where cottonwoods bent over a shallow stream. Dogs barked low, hackles raised. Children, startled, scattered toward the fires. Men rose from their places, rifles near to hand. Elias dismounted slowly, his legs stiff, boots scuffing the dust. He raised his empty hands to show he carried no threat, though the broken rifle slung across his back told a different story, a relic more than a weapon. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Food, water," he said simply, the words thick on his tongue. For a long breath, no one moved. Eyes studied him, the pale, gaunt stranger with the unshaven jaw and the hollow eyes. Then from among them stepped 3 young women, their dark hair braided, shawls draped across their shoulders. They whispered to each other, then laughed. It was not the laughter of welcome, but sharp mocking, cutting as a whip. One pointed at his boots, split at the seams. Another at his rifle, its stock bound with twine. The youngest tilted her head, bold enough to meet his gaze, and laughed at the emptiness she saw there. Elias felt heat rise in his cheeks. Their mirth was small and private to them, but to him it was the sound of every failure made flesh. It was the sound of creditors sneering as his ranch was sold, of neighbors whispering that Elias McGraw was finished, of his own brother turning away when he asked for help. He had been a man once, with land, cattle, and a wife who sang by lamplight. Now, in their eyes, he was nothing more than a beggar at the fire. He turned slightly as if to retreat to the darkness and the road again, to spare himself further humiliation. But then another voice cut through the laughter, deep, weathered, and commanding. The Apache chief emerged from the shadows, walking with a staff in one hand. His hair, streaked with gray, hung loose about his shoulders. His face bore the creases of years spent beneath desert suns, and his eyes, though old, held the steady light of judgment. He looked first at the women, and their laughter died like embers smothered by sand. Then his gaze settled upon Elias. "That you." Chief said words Elias could not understand, but the weight of them carried across the camp. The people lowered their rifles. The chief gestured for Elias to step closer, then pointed toward the three sisters who had mocked him. He spoke again, slower this time, each syllable deliberate. An elder translated roughly into English. "You stay, not as guest, as husband. To them." Elias blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. His hand touched the worn ring on his finger, the gold colder now than the desert night. He wanted to protest, that he could not, that his wife was buried back in Texas, that he was not a man fit for such a decree. But no words came. He saw the women staring back at him, their laughter replaced by wary silence, as though they too had not expected such judgment. The chief raised his staff, striking it once against the earth. The sound echoed like a gavel. The matter, in the eyes of the tribe, was settled, and so Elias McGraw, broken rancher and widower, found himself tethered not by his choosing but by fate, bound to a people who did not trust him, and to women who had laughed at the ruin he carried in his bones. As night fell, the stars stretched across the sky in a silent blaze. Elias sat apart from the fires, stomach gnawing, coat drawn tight. He felt humiliation burn hotter than hunger. But beneath it, like a coal hidden under ash, flickered something unexpected. Exile, he thought, may not be the end. Perhaps it was only the beginning of another chapter, one written against his will, yet written still. The days that followed passed with the stillness of a desert winter, quiet, watchful, and edged with a cold that settled into the bones. Elias McGraw moved among the Apache people like a shadow, tolerated but not welcomed, seen yet never fully seen. His horse had been stabled, his rifle left unused, and his hands, once skilled in branding irons and fence posts, now turned to smaller labors. The chief had not spoken further on the decree. It hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds, neither enforced nor forgotten. Elias did not press the matter. He had nowhere else to go. At dawn he rose with the smoke and fetched water from the stream. By day, he mended what was broken, a snapped stirrup leather, a torn blanket, a wagon wheel whose spokes had cracked with the cold. The tribe watched from a distance, speaking little, measuring him with sidelong glances. He worked in silence, never asking, never explaining. It was easier to fix splintered wood than to mend the fractures in himself. At night, when the fires burned low and the desert winds curled through the lodges, his mind slipped back to Texas. He saw Mary as she had been in the last year of her life, sitting by the window with her pale shawl draped over her shoulders. She would hum softly, a tune she claimed her mother had sung to her, while she stitched hems or folded linens. The memory of that shawl, its light fabric stirring in the breeze, haunted him. In the Apache lodges, when the sisters bent their heads to braid one another's long hair by lamplight, the sight stirred the same ache, the small, unguarded gestures of women shaping time against loneliness. The three sisters bore him no kindness, though their cruelty was not sharp enough to wound deeply. It was the cruelty of distance, of pride, of hearts wary from their own scars. Ayoka, the eldest, carried herself like stone, her gaze stern and unwavering. She mocked him seldom, but when she did, her words cut clean. Remarks about his fumbling hands, his strange accent, his slowness in understanding their speech. Sani, the middle sister, had a sharper tongue, laughter quick and biting. She often reminded him of the hole in his hat, of the limp in his horse, of the ring on his finger that he never took off. Her laughter had teeth, but behind them, Elias sometimes glimpsed eyes rimmed red, as if from weeping in the dark. Luyu, the youngest, was restless as a colt. She watched him openly, curiosity outweighing her contempt. She asked questions others did not. Why he never smiled, why he never sang, why his eyes always fixed on the ground when people spoke. Her laughter was less cruel, more bewildered, as though she could not decide if he were a man at all or some strange ghost blown in with the desert wind. It was on a cold evening, while he worked by lamplight mending a saddle, that Sani paused near him and noticed the scar. His shirt had slipped open at the collar, and the pale ridge of flesh stood out against his chest. "What cut you there?" she asked, her voice sharp but low. Elias glanced up, then down again, tugging the fabric closed. "A man's bullet," he muttered. She gave a dry laugh. "So you ran from him?" He did not answer. He had not run that night. But neither had he stood with courage. The scar had come from a quarrel over water rights. A neighbor turned enemy. A fight that ended with one man buried and another man hollowed out. Elias carried not only the scar but the shame of all that followed. Ayoka, listening nearby, said nothing. She only watched him with eyes that gave no quarter. Later, Luyu asked him why he never laughed. She leaned close across the fire, her braid sliding over her shoulder, her young face tilted toward him with solemn curiosity. "My wife used to laugh," Elias said quietly, surprising himself with the words. "I don't hear it anymore." The girl frowned, as though she had stepped on the edge of grief too deep for her years. She said nothing more, only turned away and plucked at her braid until the strands came loose. The truth was, Elias could not laugh because he no longer believed joy was meant for him. It was as though life itself had passed judgment, leaving him with labor and silence as his only companions. And yet, as the days thickened, he began to sense that the sisters carried their own hollow spaces. He overheard pieces of their grief, whispered among them, of brothers lost to raids along the border, of a father consumed by whiskey bought from traders, of hunting grounds swallowed by fences that stretched across the plains. Their teasing, their scorn, even their laughter. It was armor against abandonment, as his silence was armor against his own. The tribe carried loss in every face. Widows with eyes like stone, children who no longer cried when hungry, men who drank from canteens while watching the horizon as if waiting for something stolen to return. Elias realized with a slow ache that they were not unlike him. They too had been stripped of kin, of home, of certainty. But none of this was spoken aloud. Pride sealed their lips, just as it sealed his. He sat in solitude at the edge of the fire, each night, the crackle of flames masking the weight of silence between them. And yet, the silence itself began to shift. Where once it was rejection, now it carried something else, recognition, though unacknowledged. They were not family. They were not friends. Not yet. But in the hollow between his heart and theirs, Elias felt the faint stirrings of kinship. It was not enough to heal. Not yet. But it was enough to keep him there, mending saddles, fetching water, and rising each dawn with the hope that silence might one day break into something softer. The storm came without warning. The evening had fallen calm. The desert hushed beneath a gray sky heavy with the scent of rain. Elias sat outside his small quarters, sharpening a blade by lamplight, while smoke rose faint from the lodges. The sisters' laughter, distant but unmistakable, carried on the cooling air. It was the sound of normal life. Young women braiding hair, teasing, speaking in low tones around their fire. Elias kept his head bent to the knife, though the sound stirred something restless in his chest. Then the first wind struck, sudden and sharp, rattling through the cottonwoods like a hand tearing at cloth. The dogs barked, uneasy. Children were called inside. Elias lifted his eyes toward the ridge and saw the horizon split by lightning. The storm rolled down like a living thing. The wind rose to a howl, shaking the lodges. Rain fell heavy and hard, drumming the hides, running in sheets across the earth until the dust became rivers of mud. The air filled with grit and water, every breath tasting of wet sand. Elias rose, to secure his door when a crack split the night, a beam giving way. He turned and saw the sisters' lodge shuddering beneath the weight of the storm. Rain lashed the walls, the roof sagging under water, the whole structure bending like a reed in the gale. Without thought, Elias ran. He splashed through the mud, boots sinking deep, the storm blinding him with sheets of water. The women cried out as the lodge threatened to collapse. Elias reached them, shoulder braced against the central post, pushing with all his strength to hold it upright. The wood groaned, nearly giving way, but he shouted for them to move, to leave it. "Go!" he barked, voice swallowed by the thunder. "Ahyoka, clutched at her sisters, dragging them toward the opening. Luyu stumbled, shawl soaked and heavy, but Elias caught her arm and shoved her forward. Together they fled the collapsing lodge, ducking through the torrent of rain until they reached the low door of his quarters. He pushed them inside, then slammed the door against the wind, chest heaving, water running down his face. The room filled with the storm's fury, muffled by the thick walls. The fire guttered but held, flames bending and hissing with the drafts. The sisters huddled together, dripping, their braids undone, shawls clinging dark to their shoulders. For a moment no one spoke. Only the storm gave voice, hammering against the walls, thunder splitting the sky above them. Elias stood by the door, water streaming from his coat, heart pounding with the effort of holding beams that would surely have broken. It was Ayoka who first lifted her eyes to him. There was no mockery now, no scorn. Only something measuring, something altered. "You pulled us out," she said quietly. Elias shrugged, uneasy with the weight of her gaze. "Couldn't let the roof bury you." The sisters sat nearer to the fire, shawls spread to dry. The flames cast their faces in shifting light. Sani's sharp cheekbones, Luyu's restless eyes, Ayoka's stern mouth softened by weariness. The sound of rain drummed steady above them, like thousands of hooves running across the roof. Elias removed his coat, wrung it out, and hung it near the fire. His shirt clung damp to his skin, scars faint in the flickering glow. He felt their eyes on him, curiosity this time, not ridicule. The silence pressed against him until he spoke, the words rough, pulled from some place long locked away. "I've nothing left," he said. His voice cracked like the timbers in the storm. "No land, no wife, no kin waiting for me anywhere." The admission settled in the room heavier than thunder. He had not spoken it aloud before, not in Texas, not on the trail, not even to himself. To speak it now was to give shape to the emptiness, to confess that he was a man hollowed out, with nothing to offer but his own bare strength. The sisters exchanged glances. Sani lowered her eyes. Luyu studied him with something like pity. But it was Ayoka who answered. "Emptiness can be filled," she said. Her voice was steady, though softer than before. "But not with pride." The word struck him more deeply than he expected. Pride was all he had left, though it was thin and tattered. It had kept him silent, kept him apart, kept him from falling into the dust completely. And yet here, in this small firelit room, pride felt like a wall that only deepened his solitude. For a long time, none of them spoke again. They sat listening to the storm, to the rain that beat against the earth as though trying to wash away every scar. The fire crackled, the wet shawls steamed, the sisters' hair clung in dark strands around their faces. Elias sat across from them, hands folded loosely, and felt, for the first time in many years, that his presence was not unwanted. The storm raged deep into the night, but inside the walls, silence replaced laughter, not sharp and cruel but heavy, tentative, and shared. The gulf between them had not closed, but a bridge had been laid in the act of one man standing against the storm, not for himself, but for those who once mocked him. When Elias finally lay down on the hard floor, coat for a pillow, he closed, his eyes to the sound of rain, and knew a truth he had long forgotten, that a man need not own land, or wealth, or even his own name spoken kindly, to be of use. Protection was enough. It was something he still had to give. The storm passed, but the memory of it lingered in the village like smoke after a fire. Elias had braced the beams and dragged the sisters into safety, and though little was spoken of it afterward, something had shifted. They no longer mocked him so freely. Their eyes still carried wariness, but also a guarded acknowledgement, as if some debt had been laid between them. Weeks unfolded in this fragile balance. Elias moved among the tribe not as kin, not yet, but no longer as a stranger. He fetched water from the stream at dawn, splitting the thin sheet of ice with the heel of his boot. He split wood for the fires, the sound of axe striking log ringing, across the cold morning. He mended rifles, his calloused hands working carefully at flints and springs, the memory of Texas hunts guiding his fingers. The sisters watched, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering. In their lodge, now half rebuilt, quarrels rose and fell like the crackle of kindling. "Why him?" Sani would mutter when she thought he could not hear. "The chief's word binds us like cattle. Are we to live with a ghost?" Ahyoka, always, the stern one, answered flat. "A ghost who pulled us from death is better than a man who would leave us to it." Luyu said little, but her eyes betrayed her. When Elias bent near the fire, she watched him with a curiosity she no longer tried to hide. It was not scorn, not anymore. It was hunger for something unnamed. Elias heard enough to know he was the heart of their quarrels. He bore it in silence, though silence grew heavier each night. In the evenings, when he sat in the small quarters, the room filled with half-formed words and glances never met. The creak of rocking chairs, the hiss of coffee simmering in tin became the voices that spoke when none of them dared to. Mary's presence haunted him still. He saw her in every small act of domesticity, the folding of shawls, the way lamplight touched a cheek, the low murmur of women speaking in the dusk. He touched the ring on his finger often, though he hid the gesture. His wife's absence was both chain and compass, a weight that held him back and a memory that refused to let him drift entirely. Yet warmth pressed in around him. The sound of the sisters' laughter, no longer sharp, stirred something dangerous, a longing to step into life again. But what right had he? Could a man still chained to a grave open himself to living voices? The tension beneath the roof thickened like the air before a storm. It was during this uneasy season that strangers came riding near the valley. Elias was the first to see them. He had gone out to gather kindling along the ridge when the sound of hooves carried faint through the cold air. He crouched low among the rocks, watching as a group of riders approached, settlers by their dress, rifles slung across their saddles. They scanned the land like men searching not for friendship, but for claim. Elias knew their type. He had seen them in Texas, in Kansas, wherever the frontier cut its jagged edge. Men who believed every stream was theirs for the taking, every acre of grass theirs to fence, every people in their way an obstacle to be pushed aside. He returned, quickly to the village, voice low but urgent. "Riders on the ridge, 6, maybe 7, armed." The chief gathered men at once. Bows and rifles brought forth, women and children moved back toward the shelter of the trees. The sisters clung near Elias, their eyes bright with alarm. When the riders came closer, the chief went forward to meet them. Elias followed, though unease twisted in him. He knew the settlers would look at him and see one of their own, ragged, but white. He knew the tribe would look at him and see a man who might betray them. The leader of the riders called out, demanding water, demanding passage, demanding what men with rifles always demand when they feel the land belongs to them. His eyes swept over Elias and lingered. "What's this?" he barked. "A white man among savages? You've fallen low, friend." The insult burned. Elias stood stiff, his mouth dry. He could feel the sisters' eyes on him, waiting, watching. Would he stand with these men of his blood, or with the people who had taken him in unwillingly but kept him alive? His voice broke from him before he could think. "Turn back," he said. "There's nothing for you here." The words rang louder than he meant, cutting through the murmurs of the tribe. The riders sneered, spat in the dust, but at length turned their horses. Not because Elias spoke, not entirely, but because the tribe's rifles gleamed steady in the firelight, and no man eager for plunder sought to pay with his life. When the dust of their departure settled, silence remained. The tribe looked at Elias not with gratitude, not yet, but with searching. The sisters watched him as though something hidden had been uncovered. That night the lodge was filled with an air different than before. The quarrels ceased. The rocking chairs creaked in a rhythm not of anger but of thought. Sani poured coffee without a word. Luyu plucked nervously at her braid. Ahyoka at last broke the quiet. "You spoke for us," she said. Elias stared into the steam rising from his cup. "I spoke because it was right." Her eyes did not soften, but she inclined her head slightly. For Ahyoka, it was as close to thanks as words would come. For the first time since Texas, Elias felt the weight of dignity press into his chest. Not pride, not the hollow armor he had carried, but something steadier. He had stood not for himself, but for others. And in that act, he had found footing in a world that had tried to cast him aside. The tension beneath the roof did not vanish. It never would, not entirely. But it had shifted, becoming less about suspicion, more about the dangerous beginnings of trust. Winter deepened across the desert, carrying with it a silence heavier than summer's heat. Snow did not fall thick in that country, but the wind cut sharp as a blade, scouring the land and turning nights bitter. Wood became more precious than gold. Fires kept alive with care, and the tribe drew inward, gathering close to endure the season. Elias McGraw worked harder than before. His hands split logs until blisters broke and healed again. His shoulders ached from hauling water in the cold dawn. His breath steamed in the air as he carried hides against the chill. The tribe relied on every strong back, and he did not allow his to falter. Yet each night when the work was done and the darkness pressed in, it was not duty that bound him. It was the fire. In the sisters' lodge, rebuilt after the storm, flames danced within a stone hearth. It was a meager blaze compared to the endless dark outside, but it became the heart of their world. Around it, silence began to unravel. That night the wind screamed across the ridge, rattling the hides, snow spitting through the cracks of the door. Elias entered with an armful of wood, stamping the frost from his boots, his beard dusted white with flurries. The sisters sat already near the fire, shawls wrapped tight, their faces drawn with the day's labor. He placed the wood gently down and stirred the coals until sparks leapt upward, then fed the flames until warmth spread again through the lodge. No one spoke for a long while. The hiss of the logs and the moan of the wind filled the silence. Shadows wavered across the walls, stretching and shrinking with each flicker. It was Sani, sharp-tongued as ever, who finally broke the quiet. But her words did not carry mockery this time. Her voice was low, brittle, like dry reeds breaking in the wind. "I was to be married," she said, eyes fixed on the fire. He was strong, a good hunter. We had chosen a place where our lodge would stand. Her hands twisted in her shawl. "Soldiers came before the spring. They killed him in the canyon. I was left with nothing but his knife." The flames popped. The others said nothing, for the weight of truth required no interruption. Elias bowed his head, the ache in her words cutting to the marrow of his own grief. He swallowed hard before he spoke. "When my wife was lowered into the ground, the sky opened. Rain poured down as though heaven mocked us. She had prayed for rain all summer, prayed it would come to save the land. It came only to wash her grave." His voice faltered. He stared into the flames, seeing not fire but the gray sky over Texas, the wet earth filling the coffin. He had never told it aloud to another living soul. Ahyoka closed her eyes. Even her stern face softened, though she did not speak. Luyu, the youngest, leaned forward, her braid falling over her shoulder. She tore a strip of leather from a piece she had been working earlier, fingers nimble. Quietly she began weaving, over, under, tightening each loop with care. When she finished, she held the small braid out to him. "For you," she said simply. Elias hesitated. The strip of leather seemed too small, too slight to bear such meaning. But when he reached out and felt the rough weave pressed into his palm, he understood. It was not ornament, not play. It was a sign of forgiveness, of belonging, of something offered freely where once there had been only scorn. His throat tightened. He closed his hand around the braid, the gesture speaking louder than any thanks. The fire cracked, sparks spiraling, upward like stars breaking loose. The sisters leaned closer together, their shoulders touching. For the first time, Elias did not sit apart. He drew nearer, the heat of the flames warming not only his hands but the hollow within his chest. Silence returned, but it was not the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of kin who no longer needed to fill the air with words. After a time, laughter returned, not sharp, not mocking, but gentle, almost shy. Sani told a small story of her childhood, of falling into the river and being fished out by her father, dripping wet and furious. Luyu teased her for it, and even Ayoka allowed the corner of her mouth to turn upward. The sound of their laughter, low and real, filled the lodge with a kind of light the fire alone could not give. Elias listened, then let a smile touch his lips, a slow, uncertain thing, but true. He had thought never to feel it again. The night stretched long, yet none wished to leave the warmth. Outside, the storm raged, snow slanting across the desert, the wind crying against the ridge. Inside, firelight glowed, shawls steamed dry, and four souls scarred by loss began to stitch together a fragile bond. Elias looked at the braid in his hand, rough but strong. It was not a wedding ring, not the vow he had once carried in gold, but it was something perhaps greater. It was a sign that life, though torn and scarred, could be bound again. As the fire burned low, he realized a truth that settled deep in him. He was no longer only the shadow of a widower, nor merely a ghost, wandering between graves. Among those who once mocked him, he was becoming something else. A man reborn not by pride, but by the quiet acceptance of others, scarred like himself. When at last the flames sank into embers, Elias rose and placed another log upon them. The fire flared once more, and he felt in his chest a warmth that would not vanish when dawn came. The night the raiders came was moonless, the desert swallowed in shadow. A silence hung heavy over the valley, broken only by the restless shifting of horses in the corral. Elias had learned to sleep lightly, his body honed again by months of labor. But it was not his ears that woke him first. It was a feeling, the hair rising on his neck, the same chill that had warned him once on the range before bullets flew. Then came the faint clatter of hooves, too many to belong to the tribe. Elias rose swiftly, hand closing around the rifle. He had cleaned and mended with his own hands. He stepped outside, breath steaming in the cold, and saw them, figures moving like shadows against the horizon, glints of steel catching the faint starlight. Raiders. A dog barked, sharp and frantic. The camp stirred. By the time the alarm spread, the riders had already swept down, whooping like demons, gunfire shattering the night. Elias did not retreat. He planted his boots in the hard earth and fired the first shot. One rider pitched from his saddle, horse screaming, the other scattering for cover. The crack of his rifle echoed against the canyon walls, and suddenly the valley was alive with war. The sisters rushed from the lodge, shawls flying, eyes wide with terror. Elias shouted for them to stay low, motioning them behind the stacked wood. Bullets hissed past, slamming into the dirt, tearing splinters from the corral posts. The air reeked of powder and sweat. Ayoka seized a rifle of her own, firing with grim precision. Sani crouched beside her, knife glinting in the firelight. Luyu clung to the old bow of her brother, arrows trembling in her hands, but her aim steady. They were no helpless women. They were warriors' daughters, and Elias saw in their faces the same fierce will that burned within him. The raiders surged, hungry for horses, for blood, for plunder. Elias fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He reloaded with steady hands, the scar on his chest aching with each breath. But he did not falter. Once, long ago, he had fled a fight, abandoning his neighbors when outlaws struck. That shame had ridden with him ever since, heavier than any saddle. But tonight, there was no running. A rider broke through the smoke, charging straight for the sisters. Elias stepped into the path, rifle empty. He swung it like a club, the stock cracking against the man's skull, dragging him from the saddle. Pain shot through Elias's side as a blade slashed across him, but he held firm, driving the man into the dirt. The sisters' cries rang in his ears, not of fear but of fury as they struck alongside him, finishing what he began. The battle raged until the horizon paled with dawn. Horses screamed, men fell, and smoke hung low over the valley. At last the raiders broke, retreating in ragged flight, leaving their dead and dying behind. The silence that followed was jagged, filled with the moans of the wounded, the crackle of burning wood, the panting of exhausted survivors. Elias staggered, blood soaking his shirt, his rifle hanging limp. Yet he stood. His eyes met those of the Apache chief across the smoky ground. The old man, weathered as stone, studied him with a gaze that pierced deeper than any bullet. Slowly, the chief nodded once, a gesture heavy with meaning. "You are no longer outside," the chief said in measured words, his voice carrying across the broken camp. "By fire and blood you are of us." The decree of marriage, once spoken as law and burden, now felt like truth forged in trial. The sisters did not laugh. They stood beside Elias, hands resting on his shoulders as if to hold him upright, their faces solemn yet softened with something more than duty. When the sun finally climbed over the ridge, casting light upon the smoking ruins, Elias felt a peace he had not known since before the drought, before the grave in Texas. His wound throbbed, his body weary, but his spirit stood taller than it ever had. The horses were gathered, the fallen buried, the fires smothered. By midday the valley was quiet again, though forever changed. Elias found himself saddling a horse not to flee, but to ride beside those who had claimed him as kin. The sisters mounted as well, Ahioka steady and fierce, Sani sharp-eyed, Luyu smiling faintly despite the night's horror. They rode together from the battleground, the winter wind cold upon their faces, the desert stretched endless before them. Elias touched the small braid of leather still tied at his belt, its rough weave warm against his fingers. He thought of the gold band buried with his wife, the life he had lost, the man he once was. Grief would never vanish, but it no longer chained him. He was no longer only the widower of Texas, no longer the stranger mocked at the fire. He was a protector, a companion, a man who had stood his ground when it mattered most. As the sun sank behind them, casting long shadows across the trail, Elias McGraw rode not toward exile, but toward belonging. And though the road ahead was uncertain, it was no longer lonely. For in the fire of battle and the silence that followed, he had found what every broken soul longs for: a place to stand and hands to hold when the night grows cold.